You are listening to Breaking Boundaries with Brad Palumbo.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to the show. I've got a great guest with me here this week, Patrice Onwuka, a senior policy analyst with the Independent Women's Forum. Patrice, thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me, Brad.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you because this is an issue I'm really passionate about that you've done a lot of work on, and that's independent contractors. I don't know if everybody listening knows this, but for a while, just in 2020, I was an independent contractor completely freelancing for my whole income for about 5 months. So I was very interested in this subject because there's legislation in some parts of the country and being considered on the national level that would just about make that illegal. So I know you've done a ton of work on this. To start, can you tell us about the kind of anti-gig economy legislation in California and where it all started?
All right. So what happened is 2019, California decided to take a court case opinion that said that there should be a new standard to decide if a worker is an employee versus an independent contractor. The new standard was more stringent, which meant that suddenly a lot of workers would be no longer classified as independent contractors. Now, the idea was, the California legislature said we have a lot of people who work in the ride-sharing industry, for example. They work for Uber and Lyft, and they are considered independent contractors, not employees. The difference between the two, employees get benefits like healthcare, mandates around overtime pay, minimum wages, workers' compensation. Whereas an independent contractor, you're not an employee of a company. You can work for as many as you want, and you negotiate your own fees, and then you pay your own taxes. And so California said, we're going to take this court decision, we are going to codify it into law, and suddenly many of the 2 million independent contractors in California found themselves suddenly employees. But, life doesn't work as magically as that, where you snap a finger, sign a piece of legislation, and everything is changed overnight. What happened is a lot of companies, could not afford to bring people on as employees. Vox Media, for example, everybody knows Vox. Well, Vox thought that this California law, AB 5, was going to be this workers' paradise. And then they turned around the next week and fired 200 of their independent contractors who were writing their stories because they couldn't afford to bring them on full time. They only had maybe a half dozen or maybe a dozen full-time employees after that. So AB 5, it's a job-killing bill. It makes it very difficult to be an independent contractor in the state. One caveat: if you have the lobbying power to get an exemption, and we did see that a lot of different groups, associations, industries were able to get an exemption from AB 5 before the bill was passed and even after. But there are lots of small moms and pops, people who don't have a big microphone, don't have deep pockets, and were not able to get that exemption. So there's a lot of people hurting in California because of AB 5. And this was before the pandemic hit.
And it's interesting, too, that this pro-labor law immediately led tons of different workers to lobby aggressively for exceptions and to try to get exceptions from it. Like, if it was such a wonderful law helping workers, I don't know why every different worker group under the sun would be begging to be exempt from it. So one thing you mentioned is everybody thinks of the first example as Uber and Lyft, because Uber and Lyft could not exist as we know them under this legislation, because it makes it illegal to do any sort of, independent contractor agreement in the way that Uber and Lyft drivers do now, where they make their own schedule, they work wherever they want, but they don't, like you said, have all the contractual benefits. But it also affected all sorts of different occupations beyond what you'd think, right? Like florists, musicians, journalists, right? So can you talk a little bit about the unexpected groups that were impacted by this legislation, and also whether any of these people really want to be employees in the first place, or whether they wanted to be independent contractors?
Absolutely. So you talked about 3 examples of individuals who were impacted by AB 5. We have a campaign called Chasing Work where we tell the stories of people who've been harmed by it. We've talked to translators, people who go into courts to translate, from English to Spanish or Spanish to English. They lost their opportunities. We had an optometrist email us who's been, an independent contractor for 2 decades. Tell us that her business dropped 30% overnight after AB 5 was implemented. I mean, truck drivers. It runs the gamut of industries. Event planners, people who have their own small businesses, but simply can't afford to have full time staff or just don't need to. We've talked to people who are marketing professionals, people who write copy for for pawn shops. I mean, the stories are interesting and amazing. And during the holidays, we talk to performers, Santa Clauses, Mrs. Clauses, people who are hired, to play
Wow.
character roles. Yeah, Santa Claus is not coming to town. That's a professional video we produced to tell his story of how AB5 harmed them. And so this is exactly an unintended consequence. The California legislature wanted to go after big tech, and they ended up hitting all of these small guys all along the way. Now, your question, do these independent contractors want to be full-time employees? Overwhelmingly, the answer is no. A 2018 survey of women who work in the gig economy, they said, over 70% of them said they like having an independent relationship with the companies they work with. They don't want to be employees. Other surveys looking at independent contractors, well over 70% say, they like the flexibility of independent contracting. They don't want to be hired full time. And I'll tell you, there are some independent contractors who would not be in the labor force at all if they had to work as an employee. I spoke to a woman who she was raped and her rapist tried to murder her. And she
Oh
told me,
God.
Patrice, I could not sit behind a desk and interact with other people. If I could, without being an independent contractor, I could not continue to work. And at the same time, mind you, she was dealing with a divorce. She was caring for an aging parent. So these stories, they're amazing, but they're people who value flexibility. That 9 to 5, clock in, clock out, traditional relationship with an employer is not what works for their situations, whether they're working moms or they're caregivers for an aging parent, or they even have their own physical or mental illness. And so that's why independent contracting is so valuable to those workers.
Yeah, and it is interesting because this is something that affects everybody, right? But I do think to some extent it affects especially women and
Oh,
mothers.
yeah.
So just to give a personal example, when I was an editor at the Examiner, we have a roster of columnists that I would edit and work with. And a bunch of them are moms who are at home and want to be at home with their kids, but also wrote part time for us as a paid opportunity to supplement their income. Well, under AB5, that what they did would be illegal. We couldn't have them write even a weekly column without hiring them as a full-time staff member, which even if we had the budget to do that for all of them, which we didn't, but even if we did, that's not what they wanted. They wanted that flexibility. And so I think particularly for women and mothers, right? Maybe you could speak to this a little bit. That
Oh, yeah.
flexibility is key.
Oh, it absolutely is. And so when you look at the kind of people who are who are freelancers or independent contractors, almost half of them are women. Not surprisingly, that shouldn't surprise us because they're looking for flexibility. Number one, they want to be able to work around some of those different priorities they have. You have kids in school, you have aging parents that you have to take to doctor's appointments. There are a lot of women who are right now either doing delivery services or like Instacart shoppers. They like that flexibility because it allows them to keep an eye on their kids, to do whatever they need to do, even during the pandemic. That's why it's so important for our lawmakers to recognize that not every worker is the same. And this one size fits all employee model does not recognize how these new models of work are developing to meet the needs and the interests of individuals. Now, I will say, Brad, not surprisingly, what interest group does not like freelance workers and independent contractors?
Unions?
Unions. Absolutely. Ding, 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 ding. Because these independent contractors are hard to unionize. And when you unionize somebody, then you can be the boss. You can negotiate everything for them, and you can make them pay membership fees and dues, and et cetera, and gives you more leverage and power. But our workforce is moving beyond that old, outdated model of work. Hey, I'm fine if you want to be an employee. You should have that choice, though. And I think laws like AB5 are removing choice for workers in the labor force.
Well, and I think what's kind of alarming is that it's not just a California thing anymore. So this is actually something that could come to the national level because there's national legislation called the PRO Act, which House Democrats, President Biden, they support, which contains very similar features, right? So maybe you could speak a little bit about to the way this is spreading to the national stage.
Absolutely. So the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, that sounds so worker friendly, right? Also known as the PRO Act. It was introduced in 2019 or 2020 and passed, maybe 2019 and passed. But not surprisingly, the Senate was a no go in the Senate. However, we have a new federal House and Senate, and led by Democrats. And we, as you rightly said, President Biden is fully supportive of the PRO Act. And so this law would take AB5, copy and paste it, and turn it into a national law. What's really bad about the PRO Act, and I'll get into some of the other features, but particularly for independent contractors, there are no exemptions. So whereas AB5, you had a bunch of lobbyist groups exempt lots of different occupations, the PRO Act has no exemptions as written right now. So that means every single one of the, maybe 45 million independent freelancers in our country, depending on how you calculate it, they would suddenly be subjected to this new, more stringent standard that would say you are an employee unless you can meet A, B, and C. And you would see tremendously so many people overnight lose that flexibility, lose that freedom, and frankly lose their jobs because because companies cannot afford to bring them on, cannot afford the increase in labor costs as a result.
Right. And it's interesting that this has such lockstep Democratic support in terms of elected officials, because this actually is not like a partisan issue. I found this interesting, and I know you guys, maybe you can speak to this a little bit about the people you've interviewed, but the people who spoke out against AB5 in California were not all Republicans. They were not all Trump voters. When you go to hashtag AB5 stories on Twitter, or you go to the replies of Joe Biden's tweets about the legislation where he endorses it, it's full of people saying, Joe, I voted for you. Don't do this. I'm a translator. I'm a journalist. I'm a Uber driver. This will screw me over. Don't do this. To what extent is this an issue from what you've seen and the people that you've interviewed that crosses the left-right divide in terms of voters on the ground who are being impacted by it?
It is absolutely bipartisan. I mean, some of the most ardent liberals or leftist progressives in California suddenly realized that this is really bad policy, and they spoke out against it. I think it was interesting when you had repeal efforts, or even the Proposition 22, which was a ballot initiative on the ballot in November, repealing some of AB5, at least for Uber, Lyft drivers and the ride sharing folks. But a lot of those were folks who were Bernie supporters. They were Biden supporters. They were saying, you know what, I'm with you. I like unions. Hey, that's fine. But you're hurting me. I don't want that traditional job. I can't work in a traditional setting. Maybe I'm a musician and I have a band and I pay my band members through contracting. It absolutely is a bipartisan issue. But on the national level, there isn't enough information. The public is not aware that this is even in that bill. What's interesting about the PRO Act overall is that it is very much union focused, and it's about, repealing right to work laws in 27 states. It's about ensuring that even if you're not a member of a union, you're paying those dues. And then they slip in that line about independent contracting, that definition, being now based on the ABC test. So if you're not paying attention, you may not know. And there's so many people who are they have their heads down. They're in the middle of a pandemic trying to keep their businesses afloat. And the last thing they're thinking of is that the president and the Congress is going to pass legislation that would suddenly wipe out their businesses overnight. And so that's why we're doing so much public education, both about the law, but also about how it's really hurt other people in California. And Brad, by the way, this is not just the PRO Act as well. At the federal level, some different states are trying to implement similar AB5 style laws. It's insane. But I think they're looking, we've seen it slow down in 2021, fingers crossed so far. But wouldn't surprise me if they're waiting to see how the PRO Act shakes out. And if the PRO Act becomes federal law, then I think everybody's going to be up a creek without a paddle.
Right. Well, if the federal, let's talk about that a little bit. If the PRO Act became law, I mean, I don't have it right in front of me, but I know the specifics of the test it applies to independent contracting say that you can't be an independent contractor and provide a service for a company that is related to what that company directly does. So you'd have to be a plumber at Uber to be an independent contractor. You couldn't be a
Yeah.
driver. For example, as a journalist, I couldn't be an independent contractor like I am right now to this
Hmm.
day, part time in addition to my work at the Foundation for Economic Education. I
Hmm.
write a column for the Examiner as a independent contractor, a
Yeah.
1099. I write 2 columns a week. In AB5, they limited it to like 30 something columns a year.
Yeah.
So, or
They
they'd have
did.
to, and so there you go, snap of the finger. One of my major income sources is gone, but it's not just that, right? Like Uber and Lyft as we know them, all these industries would be, I think, drastically changed if not shut down, and many jobs would be eliminated. So, could you speak a little bit? What would it look like in a scenario
Hmm.
where this law passes? What happens in the next 6 months?
Oh, 6 months after, you would absolutely see um, from a legend from a from a practical standpoint, and then from a judicial standpoint. So, from a practical standpoint, I think you would see so many companies scrambling, individuals, small business owners, and also bigger companies that contract out a lot of their work, scrambling to figure out what do we do. That may mean hiring a few individuals, but that would still not fulfill all of their needs. So you're going to have a lot of people who are suddenly out of contracts, out of work, not able to, as a writer, for example, I actually do independent contracting work myself. I get a 1099 as well. So all of a sudden, maybe you're getting an email saying we can no longer contract your services. So I think individuals will be immediately impacted. Now, Uber, Lyft, they threatened California that they would leave the state. Well, they were able to get an injunction, and there's been a legal fight in California. Uber and Lyft, I think the residents of California said, "We want you here. We love your services." So I think you'd see some federal action, some judicial action. So I think maybe some larger class action suits or something challenging the law, and hopefully elevating this level to the Supreme Court at some point, for the Supreme Court to say, okay, is this test really too strong? What does this law really? Are the economic impacts far greater than the benefits that this law would provide? But the courts take time. In the meantime, I think you would see a tremendous amount of hardship, and it comes at the wrong time. We are still recovering as an economy, as a nation, from the pandemic. There's so many states like my own where a restaurant can't even have a full time, can't have more than 50% of people dining inside. For all the celebrations, the events, event planners, they hire out independent contractors. Well, if Pro Act was around, how are you going to hold your event? How could you afford to do that? So I think there would be so many rippling impacts that would be very negative, very very harmful. It would be an eyebrow raiser, and I think people would then start to speak out. Unfortunately, it would be the law of the land. So that's why I think a lot of groups like Independent Women's Forum, we're really trying to speak out against this. We're really trying to raise awareness. I think you're going to see a lot of pushback, and educating members of Congress who might vote in support, thinking, "Oh, this is a great thing," about what it's going to do to their constituents.
Yeah, and that's an interesting angle because one thing that I like about the work IWF and you have done is highlighting individual stories. I've found this as a writer, and as I've learned more about journalism and storytelling, you need statistics and facts and studies, but at the end of the day, people are often convinced by stories
Yeah.
and by personal connections that they can relate to. So, could you just maybe pick one or two of your favorite stories of people that you've met or interviewed or that IWF has that have been
Mhm.
hurt by this law, and tell us about what happened to them?
Absolutely. So the first one I will share with you. We're going to be releasing her story, I believe, either this week or next week. But she lived in California, lived through kind of the challenges of the 2008 2009 recession, and prolonged recession even after that. And she became an independent contractor. She did a lot of work in kind of the energy space, as a consulting management headhunter type role, so HR kind of professional. And she said, but as I mentioned, at one point she was raped, and her rapist tried to murder her, and thank God she got away. But she told me because of the severe PTSD, the mental and emotional impacts, she could not sit behind a desk and work like a regular person and interact with people. It took a lot of energy out of her just to be able to interact one on one with people and to trust them again. Imagine this woman would have had to have dropped out of the workforce. She also, at one point, was on welfare, and she said, I didn't want to be on welfare. I wanted to be able to take care of myself. I had to take care of my family. I have a sick mother. This woman had lots of different things going on. And what was great about her story, which is she said, independent contracting allowed me to work and work around my own circumstances. And that's true of our Santa Claus. Over the holidays, we produced a video featuring Mr. Claus. He's a performer, but boy, he has Mr. Claus down to a T. When you see him, go to our website, IWF, to take a look. But he talked about the fact that he can't, because of AB5, he's seen his Christmas holiday events dry up. Not as much work out there. Part of it is the pandemic, but part of it is the fact that, because of AB5, people weren't hiring independent contractors. And so, those mall Santas, he represented that group, that very niche market of entertainers that would go and hang out in malls and play that Santa Claus role or play different entertaining roles. These are the types of stories that I think resonate with people because these are regular people. They have regular challenges that I think a lot of people can connect with. Taking care of an aging parent, maybe having your own health issues, maybe being a retiree, but the Social Security is not enough to live off of. And so they tell their stories about how because of AB5, they've lost income, they've lost reliable jobs, they've lost their ability to be independent, and it comes right and smack dab in the middle of a pandemic. And even for the musicians that I've spoken to, they said, yeah, things started to pick back up, but now we're struggling with how do we stay in compliance because California is willing to come after you in some instances. And so, it was hard just to try to figure out what to do. I talked to a guy who had to disband his band. And he's trying to work back, figure out how he can get his band back on track and what they can do. So government policies may be well-intended. Sometimes that's the intent is supposed to be to ensure that companies are not misclassifying workers to dodge taxes or to dodge benefits. That's fine. But to implement a national policy or even a statewide policy that would impact millions of workers, you have to demonstrate that there is some sort of widespread misclassification or widespread damage. And I don't think California did that. And I very certainly don't think that at the federal level, we're seeing widespread misclassification of workers to justify the PRO Act.
So I guess to understand where people are coming from who support this kind of legislation, I mean, I get that maybe union officials or some politicians might have just openly political or corrupt interests, but a lot of average people have possibly supported this kind of thing because they do think that in Uber drivers, for example, that they're exploited or overworked or underpaid. And I think we very much agree that this is not a solution. It's a bigger problem. But is there actually a slice of the gig economy where that is true, where worker conditions really aren't great? I know some arrangements, like what I had, and really are good. But is there that slice where you could fairly say that the gig economy isn't great for workers?
I'm sure there is. I mean, I'm sure that there are some arrangements where, or there are instances where, that is not an employee, that is not an independent contractor, that should be an employee. And I think there are instances where companies do try to take advantage of workers. I'm willing to call that out. And you know what? If you are a worker and you fall into that category, you can actually seek redress. You can file charges or claims against that employer, or the company hiring company to get wages or to get whatever benefits you believe that is deserved. But I think this is a sweeping legislation and a sweeping approach that just lumps everybody together and assumes that everybody wants to be an employee. I mean, mind you, AB5 and the PRO Act starts from the position that everyone is an employee, and then you have to prove that you're not. That's a very different position than to say that you are an independent contractor and proving that you're actually an employee. And it puts the onus now on companies. And I just think that, when we think about, broad sweeping legislation, we've got to be careful that you're using a big paintbrush when really you just need a fine tip brush to deal with some of those issues. If it's enforcement, hey, put some money behind enforcement and go after the wrongdoers. But don't assume every worker, every employee, every employer is a wrongdoer, and that every employee wants that traditional employment model of work.
Right. I mean, I definitely see what you're saying. One question I have, and maybe this is straying a little bit out of the specific to independent contractors domain, but it's not enough, I think, for conservatives and the right and free market policy people to just oppose democratic legislation, oppose blue state legislation, which it is bad, and I'm against it. We should oppose it, but I'm saying we also, I think, need to offer our own solutions for what could we change about policies to improve the working class or offer more opportunity. So I'm wondering if, even whether it's relative to independent contracting or other issues, what do you think that free market solutions or conservative policy solutions could be to help these same groups of people, this working class?
Absolutely. Well, specifically for independent contractors, there are those who want to see more benefits. There may be, in the instance of many women, many of them get their benefits, their health care from their spouse's primary job, which is a traditional employer. But there are some who maybe are single, retired, they may divorce, whatever the case is, and they don't get those benefits. There are companies out there that actually provide those to independent contractors. And the question is, how do you find them? And I think providing resources, and there are some groups, the conservative groups, that are now thinking through at the state level, what are the types of resources that where an independent contractor can find their own health care, or can maybe join some sort of cooperative or collective where they're able to, buy into, plans that you'd only be able to buy into as an employee of a company. So I think providing those resources, those free market, private sector resources are a really great starting point. At the federal level, I think we need to think through how we envision employment, and thinking less about connecting benefits to one employer. This hits at healthcare, but I think it hits at a lot of the different types of benefits. How do we make benefits portable so that they carry on with the employee, rather than when you leave an employer, that's it. You don't get the healthcare coverage, you don't get the workers' compensation. Even thinking through Social Security. We know that it's not a savings account, so to speak, where you put in money and then 60 years later you take out exactly what you've earned, what you've put in there. But there is a way of making Social Security more flexible to meet the needs of a worker in a given stage of their career. At IWF, we kind of pioneered the idea of tapping Social Security when you're young and you're in your childbearing ages and you want to take some earned paid leave or paid time off to have a baby. Well, why not, be able to tap into your Social Security and theoretically pay it back over time? It's technically your money, although we know that that's not how Social Security works. But government can be more innovative and thinking through how we as workers, where we get our benefits from, how we carry them from place to place, and the money that we pay into these social safety net programs, how we can make them more flexible to meet the needs at different stages of our careers.
Well, I think that is an interesting point and a good place to leave the kind of serious talk. But everybody's favorite part of the show is the hot food take at the end. And Patrice, I told you at the beginning of the episode so you wouldn't be caught off guard, as you had half an hour to think up what your controversial food opinion is going to be. So go ahead and lay it on the audience.
Okay, goat meat. I love goat meat. I'm from the Caribbean. I am married to a Nigerian man. We eat a lot of goat meat. Both of our cultures do. And I know for some people, they think of a goat and the ram and the heads and they just get like, no way. But think about it. It doesn't have to be gamey. I think it's tastier than chicken, and it's not as tough as beef. So folks, think about it. It's great in curry. And if in doubt and you don't know where to get how to prepare it, go to a nice African or Caribbean restaurant. They will fix you up.
That sounds good to me, though I'm just enough of a carnivore that it's like, oh, it's meat? Sounds good. But maybe some people will have some strong thoughts on that. I know Bill Gates just said everybody should switch to synthetic meat within the next 10 years, and I won't be doing that. So
Neither will I. I'm a meat eating girl as well. So I'm right there with you, Brad.
all right, Patrice, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
You are listening to Breaking Boundaries with Brad Palumbo.